Bobby, you here again?
Yeah, my doctor told me to reduce stress at work, so I come to Buffalo Wild Wings to eat lunch and watch sports. I get to pick one of 7 entrees, like sandwiches and salads, plus one of 7 sides.
Well, I like sides.
It's so affordable I can finally take a vacation.
Where you gonna go?
Here, Tim, here.
Introducing the new B-Dubs Fast Break Lunch Menu, starting at a new low price. Dine in or order takeout weekdays between 11 and 2. Participation and availability may vary. Buffalo Wild Wings. Wings, beer, sports.
Blog Talk Radio. Welcome and thank you for joining us on Unlimited Realities Radio. I am your host, Lisa Zimmer Mahoney, and we have a very special guest today, best-selling author Oriah Mountain Dreamer, author of The Call, The Dance, and The Invitation. And today we're going to be discussing the winter solstice, which this year it falls on December 21st. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what the darkest day of the year means and how its effect can be looked at as a way we often go through our shadow side and our dark side of doubts and fears and insecurities, and how we evolve and come out into the light, as in the advent of Christmas. So I want to thank you, Oriah, so much for being on Unlimited Realities. Welcome.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Okay, now we have found.
So we're moving into the season of Christmas, and of course we still have Hanukkah ongoing, and we have several, celebrations this month that I don't believe is any coincidence. It falls around the winter solstice, and I find this topic today really timely. I've been really inundated with a tremendous amount of people struggling this season, and in addition to the economy being challenging, it's a challenging time for many people anyway because of the holidays. And when we're supposed to be up and we're supposed to be happy and we're supposed to be joyful, oftentimes it's really extra pressure for those who are really struggling. And so, can you talk to us a little bit about what the winter solstice can really signify and symbolize to us as we move through this period in our lives?
Absolutely, and it's somewhat ironic that given the nature of the time in the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, that we do have this culture that is, and this is particularly true in the States to a little lesser degree in Canada, but still there, it's extremely extroverted culture. So it values most the kind of shining times, the times of brightness and light, and is, there's this kind of cheerleading enthusiasm for the light. And of course, the difficulty with that is that you can't have that all the time, and in fact it would wear you just completely to a frazzle, which might explain why so many of us are worn to a frazzle, without some of the inward turning times, some of the darker times when you get not just insights but rest, real deep rest, from the times of darkness. I mean, this is, in the northern hemisphere, the time of hibernation for animals when they go into the long, deep sleep. I will say that this is probably the time of year around the winter solstice when I feel most connected to the dream of the ancestors, because I always have this kind of sense of what it was like for our ancestors who did not have electricity. The only artificial light they had was perhaps fire. And, if you were living in a cave, for instance, as the days got shorter and the nights got longer and colder, there would be a kind of instinctual move to a kind of slowing down of everything and everything moving into kind of a hibernation. And also many cultures, those cultures, would see it as a time of dreaming. Now here's what's interesting about dreaming. When I'm talking about dreaming, I'm talking about really a kind of inward turning, allowing the imagination to go where it wants, the unconscious to speak to us. When I put this out often, what I hear from people is about a kind of goal-setting process, which is not quite the same thing. And I'm not bad-mouthing goal-setting, but goal-setting is a step after the dreaming, where you're now putting into concrete plan. And it's indicative of, again, what an extroverted and achievement-oriented culture we have, that people would interpret dreaming as a time to sort of set goals for the next year. When what I'm, inviting in is a kind of more moving into the places in ourselves where shadow material is. And by shadow material, I really just mean aspects of self, the unconscious, that we don't know about. It may be good news, it may be not such good news, but it's not necessarily dark stuff in the sense of ooh, although certainly we do tuck the kind of ooh knowledge of ourselves down there. But it's also, it's a place where we stash our old sorrows that need some attention. Some of our fears, right? Things that really do have a huge impact on us without us knowing because they're in the unconscious. So mostly the winter solstice is in part a great time to invite and make the space for, that would be the catch, because if you're racing around, you can invite material from your unconscious to come up, but you're not going to notice it when it does because you're just running around so much. It's also, so I have some questions that I ask sometimes of myself in those periods, and when I'm doing sort of a deeper meditation and allowing, one of the questions is, where am I a fundamentalist? Because that will point me in the direction of some of my deepest fears about things will come out, and I will discover that I've created absolute rules and laws about things to try and protect myself from those fears of unpredictability. One of the other questions I would ask is, where do I find it difficult to hold an aspect of myself or the other in my heart? And, there's so much political discord and whatnot. All you have to do is think about a family member with whom you disagree vehemently about politics, and think about, when they're offering their absolute sense of what's right, how hard do I find it to hold them in my heart, not to remove myself from them, not to call them names internally or externally.
That's a very good check-in point right there.
Yes. So I think what gets raised for us in the darkness is very similar to what would have been for our ancestors, is that we're pushed right up against the facts of reality, which is that in the world we live in, the future is unknowable and unpredictable. That's always true, but I think we feel that more with the lengthening darkness and finding a way to let ourselves be with that. Now, traditionally, in pretty much all cultures, people would do that. They would withstand the darkness, so to speak, together with a circle of community. And it's not that they would, sit in the dark. They would light a fire, and in a sense, what we're talking about metaphorically is seeing things with maybe a little softer light, not the stadium lights, but a candle or a fire that lets us see a little bit of ourselves in the shadow.
Right. Now, when we're going through this dark part, because everybody does, regardless of if they admit it or not, we all have stuff. And we all have moments where, we're challenged. We're challenged on our beliefs. We're challenged on our thoughts. We're challenged on how regimented we've been in our thinking. And I loved that question you posed in regard to how much of a fundamentalist am I? Because sometimes we go through life and we don't realize what we've been handed, either from our role models or our parents or society or our peers. And it may not necessarily be our beliefs. It may not be our truth. And so, sometimes that unearthing that depth of ourselves is necessary, but people really don't. There's a good majority of people who really don't know how to begin that process. And so, going into the darkness or going into the dark, cave of ourself and our heart and our soul is something a little scary. And yet, how can we encourage people to not run away from that and actually understand that this is a part of all of us, and to move through it in regard to there is going to be a light at the end. It's inevitable. There can't be light without dark. So we move through the dark to get to the light, but how can we move through it confidently? How can we move through it knowing if we don't have support, if we don't have the soul connections that we really can use and utilize in our growth.
And of course, that's one of the sad things. I mean, one of the things I didn't mention is that the solstice really and always has been in the middle of the darkness, and also reassurance that the light will return. That's why Christmas is celebrated now. It's about the promise of the Sun Child, the Christ. And these wonderful stories predate any time posited of when the historical Jesus was. I mean, they come from mythologies all over the world. So again, our ancestors always had this reminder of, and the light will return. And that's important to know that. And, there are times when we're in our darkest times when that seems like a theory, and a pretty flaky theory at that. And that, I think, is when we do lean often into another's faith. We're with somebody who can be with us. The hardest is if people are really isolated and alone. Mother Teresa said that in the West, the spiritual impoverishment of people who were isolated was probably the worst impoverishment and the most difficult to address, because it was hard sometimes to find and connect with folks, So it's what I would say for most of us is that we also need to start small. Like, we need to build up our muscle of looking at our own rigidity. And one of the ways to do that is to take your very simple daily kinds of patterns and reverse them. So long as they don't do any harm, do them 180 degrees differently. So, for instance, I'm generally known as being pathologically punctual. I'm always on time. So what I might do is decide that for a week I'm going to be late. I can't tell you how difficult that is for me. And, of course, it erases
Oh, that's interesting.
Immediately all kinds of things that are fairly unconscious about what I think about what being on time or being late means. Reliable people are on time. People who are good people are reliable. There's all kinds of beliefs behind this that I don't really think about, but are clearly there when I attempt to do the opposite. One of the big ones is food. People have all kinds of rigid rules around food. And again, without doing yourself harm and poisoning yourself by drinking alcohol all week or something, you just, for 1 week, reverse that and see what happens. And you begin to find all these shadow belief systems that you're not actually explicitly advocating, but are clearly there in yourself. So starting small is a good idea. Right, not starting with, my shadow about my mother, just starting with my shadow about being on time. Start with the 2 pound weight.
And I'm sure that it gets a little bit, uncomfortable when you have to reverse 180 degrees, because you feel like you're a foreigner in your own body.
Absolutely. And also the temptation, of course, is to explain to everybody. So one of the things about this is don't explain. So in other words, I can't arrive, if I'm doing this, I can't arrive late and say, sorry, but I'm doing this experiment where I'm, and I feel that impulse because I want people to know.
Does anybody ever call you out or question you on it? Like, Oriah, you're always so punctual. Why are you 15 minutes late today?
Yeah, and so it would just be, that's the way it worked out. Sorry about that. Of course, generally speaking, it's not a big deal for the other people, right? It's a big deal to me because my pattern is to be on time, and on some level to think, not even to think, that's too conscious, but to believe that says something about me, right? And I would say the reverse, too. If you're habitually late for a week, absolutely commit to being early or on time. Right? And see what happens then. I've had people do this, actually, and, of course, what comes up for them is they're feeling controlled. They're feeling, compelled by other people's agendas, even though they agreed to meet somebody at a particular time. So it doesn't matter which it is.
And there's something you wrote about a few weeks ago that has stayed with me, and I want to bring it up now because I feel like it's timely in regard to this topic. But you wrote about this little exercise that you go through when you're in a stressful situation, in where you breathe through the soles of your feet. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I found that an amazing tool when I'm around somebody who's a little